Let me start introducing the speaker that we have for today's session, Professor Scott Duke Kominers. And Scott is chair professor of business administration at Harvard Business School, and is in the entrepreneurial management unit. He has also a number of other affiliations, one with the Department of Economics and the other one with the Center for Mathematical Sciences and Applications. And he's also a partner at A16Z. And that's where I think we had our first proper conversation, despite the fact that we have been following each other. And
exactly.
We have known each other for a long time. At least we are familiar with the works.
That, through work and conferences and all of the above.
But editorial work and stuff like that. Exactly. And I think he's a very well-known scholar in the community. He's editor of very important journals like Review of Economic Statistics, Journal of Economic Literature, and he has also been advising a number of companies on topics related to mechanism design, incentive design. I think he has written a lot of very interesting and influential papers in the field. Without further say, I think we should get started and discuss about blockchain, which is the topic that we want Scott to comment on today. And we have always, Fahad, myself, many others in the community have been looking at blockchain, and the focus has always been on the finance perspective. So how can we design decentralized market on blockchain? What would be the best use case for DeFi? And today, instead, we want to see what other applications or other services one can build on blockchain aside from finance. And that's the thing where I would like to pick Scott's brains, because Scott has been one of the few individuals I know who has been doing work on mechanism design of blockchain and related topics, not necessarily with a focus on finance. So I would like, Scott, to see if you can comment on what you think is the bullish case for blockchain outside of finance.
Excellent. Well, first of all, when we're talking, I have no opinion about using the terminology in finance, but we're talking outside of finance, there's not like bullish or bearish or whatever. It's what's the conceptual use in my mind? And the way I think about it is, blockchains are ways of establishing digital property rights over digital goods and commitments over the architecture of digital systems. And those two features are really powerful, right? So if you think about the sort of fundamental construction of a ledger as a record of, sort of what has happened and what might happen in the future in a way that's, agreed upon and sort of provides a system of that people can reference and cross-reference and understand. We do a lot of things with physical goods where there's either a true ledger, right? If you, own a car or a house, you probably have it registered and, you have a deed, and that's then registered with the government or other agency that keeps track of it. There are lots of goods where we don't bother to record ownership directly because, if you have a lacrosse ball on your desk, the shadow cost of taking notes on who owns it is too high, but we know ownership because you have control over it. But in practice with digital goods, it's been really, really hard and sort of effectively not possible to do that without blockchains and sort of similar architectures that enable you to establish ownership over digital goods without sort of a single central controller, right? So people are thinking if you're listening to this podcast, you're thinking, wait, but I have lots of digital goods. I have books on my Kindle, or I have songs on iTunes or something of the sort. But note that those are contained within an individual service, right? There's a platform that manages those architectures and controls ownership and sometimes makes changes, right? So there's this, very, apocryphal but really happened case where Amazon withdrew Kindle copies of 1984 from people's Kindles. Turns out you do not exactly own your digital books. You own them subject to the terms of service, where you could never imagine Amazon or any other bookseller walking into your house and taking out the copy of 1984. Or if you could imagine it, you can imagine it would be immediately followed by sort of a a police report for your stolen property. Blockchains enable digital assets that have that same degree of individual control that physical assets have, right? And then in particular, it's not just that they're within the user's control, but they don't rely on a platform to provide their function. So you can imagine having ebooks. In fact, I have some as NFTs. You can have an ebook that you own, you control, and that even if the publisher or the platform that manufactured it disappears, you still have that book. It still has all of the functionality that it has for you, in the same way that if a bookstore where you bought a book goes out of business, the book is still in your hand and you can still read it.
So, as you were talking through that, there were sort of initially two things that were coming to my mind. And I was going to ask you about which of those were more important if somehow they were kind of the two key things. But I think you sort of answered that. So let me maybe frame it to you and you tell me if I'm even understanding what you're saying correctly. So there is an angle where people talk about, when they talk about sort of provenance of assets, that they bring up blockchain. And a lot of times what they're really talking about is in some sense like inefficient back offices, and the recording of this ownership is on some piece of paper somewhere, and God knows where that piece of paper is, and so it creates a whole bunch of inefficiencies. But then there's another piece which I really started to think of when you were talking about, for instance, I have a book on my Kindle, and then Amazon goes away, or whomever is kind of responsible supposedly for this goes away. Do I still have this thing? So this gets a little bit more into something, well, self-custodying is one thing, but I almost start to think about when people talk about security of blockchains through the lens of sort of specifically permissionless blockchains. Because otherwise, for instance, like if there's a centralized party where they are operating this blockchain, and I suppose I could still have custody on their blockchain of a particular asset, but maybe if they're like the only permission node, that they could somehow reverse that or something to that effect. So if I'm understanding correctly, first of all, like there's those two pieces. One is like just kind of let's call it an efficient way to store data, an efficient way to record who owns what. And another piece is more of like, let me call it security, of that, I can actually own this and you can't stop me from exercising my custody over it. So which of those is sort of more important, I suppose?
Yeah, great question. I mean, and it varies from asset category to asset category, right? Like it's sort of, first of all, you're totally right? There's sort of there's an infrastructure efficiency, and the openness of the infrastructure is helpful, right? Like and in fact, Web 2 had a lot of this relative to, pre-web, right? There are lots of people who would never have been able to access the classical publishing system who were able to publish Kindle ebooks as their first publishing activity. And, but there's still an intermediary there, right? There's still Amazon as the sort of broker of who can publish. And maintaining, sort of the maintainer of the published works. One feature of blockchain infrastructure is that, and again, often decentralization is a key component of this, right? Sort of ensuring the openness of the infrastructure, is that anybody who wants can come and create a digital asset. They can create an ebook. They can create sort of, anything within the structure of the software that runs the blockchain. Within the affordances of the software that runs the blockchain, they can create that without necessarily relying on an intermediary, right? They can use an open protocol that's sort of committed to be open, committed to be accessible, and has sort of, rules and functions that anybody can access. That's very important, both because it removes a lot of the sort of logistical frictions that the intermediaries are typically mitigating, that they're... I like to believe the intermediaries are not intentionally adding frictions, but they're addressing the problem that without them there would be a lot of friction, right? Like you actually, so a reason we have like very valuable pieces of property, like, recorded by governments, because you want a very stable record of ownership. So you're right. There's like a big efficiency gain from replacing some of the things that we normally do via reputation or other sort of like high friction, hard to create features, are now just done via code. But then, as you say, there's also this custody component, right? There's this, property rights are, sort of it's a different model. And I'm guessing your listeners probably already know this, but again, just in framing how I think about this, like, to me, the fundamental difference in between Web 3 and sort of prior models of the web is this idea that you own your digital assets, your sort of your a lot of your data, your identifiers, all these different things, and you bring them with you across the web. Again, in the same way you might bring a bunch of books in your backpack, you can bring your ebooks, sort of in your own single account that you bring to everything else. And so you have control in so in this account, this gives you permission to interact with your assets on the ledger. And the ability to have, your own direct control of that account, and have the account, in fact, even somehow be, somewhat robust even to changes in how the account management structure works, right? Like, people have, who move their seed phrase from one wallet provider, one wallet host to another. Even if you have a custodial wallet, right? The ability to extract all of your, information from that, right? You can at any point, if you want, take those assets out of the custody system and move them to some other custodian, same as you would with like a bank, right? If you'd like withdraw your money and move it to a different bank. That degree of user control hasn't really existed in the internet before, at least not in any way that's at scale. And it enables a new type of property right, right? Like, now you have property rights not within the confines of a platform, but rather like, yourself as an individual, relative to all the information that's recorded on the database as under your control.
Yeah. So here I would like to, I think we have mentioned, I would like to separate two different concepts. One is like the fact that you have this custody of your asset or of your tokens, whatever, which is enabled by the fact that everything is a digital representation on the platform. And the other is the fact that you are decentralizing these services. Like, you could have essentially a system where you maintain self-custody of your asset, even if it's centralized, right? And vice versa, you could have a decentralized system where you don't have custody of your assets. So I'm thinking, to what extent we need, and my understanding is, based on the previous discussion, is that, okay, by having decentralization, we reduce some of the intermediation risks that we have in a centralized systems. But is it completely clear? Is it completely clear that the decentralized infrastructure doesn't bring additional costs or frictions that perhaps are comparable?
It does. No. So to be clear, decentralization is costly, right?
It's costly, right? So then I'm thinking, wouldn't there maybe another design where we, again, ensure that everybody can have custody of your assets, so we have zero counterparty risk and so on, combined with decentralized infrastructure, be maybe a more prominent solution?
Yeah, great question. So, Christian Catalini and Ravi Jagadisan and I wrote an article about this a handful, maybe 4 years ago. To be clear, absolutely, for different applications, one might choose different positions on the frontier between, operational efficiencies and degree of sort of, degree of security that comes from code rather than from institutional reputation, right? Like, I am not the type of, I'm not a maxi, right? I don't think that like every single thing should be on an absurdly decentralized system. Like, sometimes reputation and a small number of high reputation players is actually enough to maintain a sufficient amount of decentralization for people to trust the system and for it to not have a single point of failure. Like, that's absolutely true. But critically, decentralization comes with a type of commitment power that centralized applications do not have, right? Sure, you can have a centralized system that promises individuals self-custody, but if the centralized system controls, sort of how all of the architecture works, they don't have a way to credibly commit that they won't necessarily change it down the line. And this, my colleague at A16Z, Chris Dixon, talks a lot in his book, Read, Write, Own, about the idea of commoditizing the complement, right? Like, lots of early, sort of Web 2 platforms started out by having these big open ecosystems where they invited lots and lots of, lots and lots of partners to, provide features that they didn't have. And then gradually, sort of companies that had built their entire business on being able to access Facebook or, more recently Twitter or Zwitter or whatever we're calling it now, suddenly now are held up, right? Like, the company gains, much stronger network dominance and has the ability to, to hold them up or produce competing products. And, a key feature, I mentioned actually at the beginning, I was talking about property rights and commitment. a different feature that blockchains bring that's also really important in making a lot of these market design loops work is the ability to commit to function, right? If you have a decentralized system where ownership is shared among sort of your main user constituencies, and maybe we'll put an asterisk on that because there's another confusion that sometimes people have, which is that they actually think that this implies that every single user of a product should be a part owner of that product, which is not necessarily true, depending on context. But if you have an architecture that has shared ownership by your user constituencies, then that provides some, bulwark against ways in which the system might later choose to expropriate as it gains network dominance, right? It enables you to have a network that has a very strong network effect, but where its hands are tied, in effect. Sorry, that was a poorly said. It has a very strong network effect, but its hands are tied in practice. It can't make changes that participants of the network, don't jointly agree on. And sometimes you can go even further, right? Like for a lot of protocols, you don't even need upgradability in the same way. And in that circumstance, you can have a completely immutable protocol, right? You can have a set of rules that are guaranteed to not change because they're, in effect baked into the blockchain in the same way as you might bake functions into a chip in silicon.
So I'd like to double click a bit on this point that you were just discussing towards the end there.
Sure.
That you mentioned at the outset, the commitment point, because as you said, like a lot of the early part of this conversation actually focused on that first prong.
Property rights.
About sort of, yeah, exactly. And okay, there's a few different paths here, but I'm going to frame it in a way that is a bit of, there are critics who frame it this way, and I think it'll lay it up nicely for you to choose how you want to go with this. But I know people who will say about this, about sort of blockchain technology in general, that, okay, so as we said earlier, you have property rights, you can custody assets. But what are these people actually going to do? What are retail investors, for instance, going to actually do with these assets that they can now custody? And this gets into the commitment thing precisely because presumably they're going to use the commitment in order to do something. But you've written a lot actually about various applications where that kind of think fully or give good answers to this. So maybe you could walk us down a little bit in thinking about how we take advantage of this commitment and actually get value in some sense out of that custodying in the first place.
Yeah, absolutely. And let's see, where do we want to start? So I'll start with an example. That's very, very simple and is top of mind for a lot of people. So it's funny, Steve Kaczynski and I wrote this book called The Everything Token. It's about non-fungible tokens and sort of the framework for how they create value and how you build businesses around them. When we published the book, one of the questions we got most frequently was, and the book came out, key to set the time. The timing came out in early 2024. And when the book came out, the most common question we got was like, so what would you put in that didn't make it into the book? And in the time since we'd had to put the pen down and like turn in the page proofs, and when it came out, suddenly AI fakes had gotten completely photorealistic and completely commoditized. And people were starting to say versions of like, oh gosh, if only you had a digital driver's license, right? Like we might one day soon need to be able to sign all of our, social media posts as ourselves. And more broadly, like, platforms like, online dating sites are now full of AI fakes, right? Like suddenly there's a need to prove personhood. And, the funny thing about a driver's license, of course, is that like you go and get it, it's certified, but then you can use it to prove your identity in a bunch of contexts without any interaction with the issuer, right? Like, whether it's, if you're, God forbid, you're pulled over on the side of the road for speeding, or if you're like walking into a restaurant and proving that you're of legal drinking age, or you're like, signing up for a utilities plan for your house or something. Like all of these things often require ID. And so long as the entity is set up to read and interpret a driver's license, they can look at your driver's license and interpret it as an ID and verify your identity without having to call the DMV or the Department of Motor Vehicles or Registry of Motor Vehicles, whatever it's called in a given state, and say, hey, so I've got Scott Kominers here. He asserts that he's over 21, and he presented an ID with these numbers. Can you check them? No, they can look at the ID and tell what it is. And driver's licenses are forwards compatible, and they're in your control. right? So you have the asset in a wallet in your pocket, and anytime you need to prove your identity, and you can show your driver's license to someone, and so long as they understand how to read it, they can interpret it. We don't have, thus far, forwards compatible proof of identity for the internet, right? We have some accounts that are very ubiquitously connected, right? Like maybe your Google login is used to log into lots of services that are not officially part of Google. But what we really need is a way for people to have a certified identifier of themselves, right? Think like a digital driver's license, but that they can take with them to any platform. Any platform that currently exists can choose to recognize it, and any platform that exists in the future could also choose to recognize it. Forwards compatibility. It doesn't just, rely on the architectures and platform structures and APIs we have today, but anybody in the future could choose to recognize this digital driver's license, just as if I open a new restaurant, I can sort of assess people's ages off their driver's licenses. And this is basically blockchains are essentially the only architecture we have that could provide this sort of use case, right? That allows you to have a digital asset that is a certified proof of identity of yourself, and that nobody can cut off your ability or meter your ability to share with others, right? They can commit to open access, of your ability to prove who you are, and any platform in existence can just choose to recognize, right? There's it exists in an open source framework. They can just say, okay, cool. We're going to, allow you to sign your social media posts on whatever social media platform, whether it's, sort of Meta's Facebook or again, I keep saying Twitter, I guess it's X, so you put your X here, sort of like you do at the end of signing a letter or something. You would have a digital asset that proves your identity and that you can take with you across the internet and use in all manner of ways and circumstances, including ones we haven't imagined yet. And we're starting to see these sorts of structures. World has a World, which is the sort of architecture around WorldCoin, has a proof of personhood identifier of this style. And we're starting to even see sort of different registries experiment with things like putting car registration on blockchains for sort of general proof of ownership to lots of different applications. Digital product passports, maybe you own a refrigerator and your refrigerator is going to be serviced by many different types of service providers, and you want to keep the history of the refrigerator attached to, sort of to that asset and to your ownership of the asset. Same thing, right? You need a forwards compatible, refrigerator log, the technical name is a digital product passport that anybody who interacts with your refrigerator can stamp. And all of these things are cases where it's a very simple digital asset, right? It's really just like a registration asset with some identifying information. And it fundamentally relies on the ability to, have the thing in your self-custodied control and to be able to share it and use it flexibly across circumstances without the creator being able to meter the ways in which it's used.
Right. So I want to, if I can, I just like to flesh this out a bit more. Early on, when in that response, I started thinking about something that I think you very clearly sort of clarified, particularly here at the end, why it doesn't work, which is you even mentioned, Gmail accounts. Like Google loves to sort of tie itself to all these different things and would love if they are sort of the identity system for the world. But, as you said, they can cut you off. And that's probably kind of a fundamental issue with these sorts of things. But then I started to think about something else, which was because when you were talking about sort of authenticating maybe like a message, for instance, I started thinking about cryptographic systems, right? And of course, this I think goes back to the 1950s. Obviously, blockchains use them, but they existed well before. But then you said something that a bit like sort of maybe clarified why that by itself is not sufficient, if I'm understanding correctly, because you also talked about kind of the storage of the history associated with something, right? And that starts to get very much like, yeah, now I'm thinking, okay, blockchains, clearly it's a ledger, so you can store stuff there, and it has an identity system usually tied to it, let's say ECDSA or something. And so you certainly have those two pieces there. And I suppose if you have those two pieces, you more or less have a blockchain. I mean,
Exactly.
we can get into semantics about what a blockchain is, but am I understanding you right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And your point is well taken, right? Like, people have had cryptographic keys since long before there were blockchains, and like you could use them for, if you're self-hosting your email or something, right? You have your own email keys. But yes, the second you get to identifiers with history, and you need all of this to be secure and accessible by multiple parties, right? Like, in the refrigerator example, you don't just need read access by all possible, sort of parties to servicing the refrigerator, but you actually need to be able to permission write access too, right? The second you get there, I think you've basically sort of like you've morally arrived at a blockchain architecture, whether there are other sort of technical ways to implement it or not. Like, you basically need a sort of decentralized, like, immutable and open ledger.
Yeah, I wanted to follow up on this. I agree that one somewhat innovation of blockchain is the fact that you can keep track of the history and it's immutable, and you can track back, get information you want. Of course, this is useful because, of course, it assures a lot of transparency. Of course, again, it doesn't have to be done by a decentralized infrastructure. It could easily be done by a centralized entity. Perhaps the use case here for blockchain would be that if you delegate this responsibility to a centralized, let's say, administrator, you might have a possibility that they change somewhat the history, or
all sorts of failure risks.
I would say, but suppose that this is maybe maintained by an entity such as the government, then I think would this be like? What would be the cost of, like, for example, the replacing blockchain with maybe a ledger, let's not call it distributed, maintained by a centralized entity, which is completely trustable. And I think a related question that I want to ask is also most of the discussion is about the fact that you can share information, as you mentioned, Scott, whenever you need, because it's there, it's stored safely and transparently. But this also brings the question about privacy, in the sense that I might want, for example, for the refrigerator, maybe I don't want people to see what I'm consuming or what, for different reasons. So the question is more like,
right.
And there, should it be permissionless or should be maybe permissioned? And that's what I would like to hear your point. Like,
great question. And it's funny, as I was saying the thing about anybody who interacts with the refrigerator, I was thinking, oh gosh, maybe I should clarify that I don't mean literally every person who opens the refrigerator door, but like when someone comes and repairs the refrigerator, they note, like, I serviced this component on this date, light bulb was replaced on January 15th, whatever. It would be, although honestly, like, the whole concept, like, I feel like you could write an entire sci-fi novel about the concept of, like, a refrigerator that serves all the information of everything that's ever gone in and been removed from it, a short story at least. But I think it's very important to distinguish, two different forms of privacy and permissionness, right? There's sort of global privacy, and then there's, like, user control of data. And, like, at the moment, a lot of blockchain architectures are sort of very, like, 0-1 on user control of data. Like, users can control the way in which their data is used and accessed, perhaps, right? You can permission, like, what's able to modify the sort of the information in your account. And you can permission which applications are allowed to directly connect to your account, but at the same time, you have everything lives on a big open architecture, and often permission is all or one, like, or all or nothing. Like, I can, permission access to my account or not access to my account, and actually it's pretty hard to, like, cordon off individual components. So maybe, and as you say, like, maybe I want to, share the history of my refrigerator with the person who's going to be fixing it, but I don't want to also at the same time share my medical records or something like this. And so I definitely think a key component of making these systems practicable for a wide range of applications, and especially, again, sort of if we really think that they're going to be an individual's sort of cross-platform digital identity, is giving the individual not just the ability to permission whether a platform can interact with their account, but what information gets seen, what information the account can interact with, and all of that has to happen in a way that's intuitive and accessible to the average individual, right? We don't want, you don't want to have to make a decision about should Or rather, you don't want to have a default setting of when someone comes to repair my refrigerator, they also get my complete medical record, right? You need smart defaults and intuitive permissioning, and both the infrastructure layers and the wallets have to support that, right? Like we need innovation on two different levels to make that happen.
So, again, I have a couple different thoughts, and maybe I can come up with a question that will allow you to pick, but let me take a shot here. So one piece is sort of maybe on a more practical dimension on this privacy point, because part of what I heard you saying is that it would be good if users have optionality as to what is the privacy level of particular things, right? Like they may actually want to have, for instance, the history of the car that they're driving in terms of maintenance actually be available, because when you go to the next, you move, and
exactly,
you go
raises
to the
the resale
person,
price if you're going to sell it to someone else or something. Yep.
Yeah, and everybody's had to like refill forms, for instance, and you don't know where the information is in the first place. So there's that, but then of course there's very sensitive things that you don't want everybody to have access to. But I'm wondering a bit on the technical side, how plausible that is. Of course, there's a lot of stuff in CS about I forget the terminology, but basically about being able to in fact do operations over top of encrypted information, so that you can simultaneously have things encrypted but yet actually have it be usable. And usually, in my impression, which is a very naive impression, and please do disabuse any errors that I put out, that in those cases, a lot of times there's sort of a cost hurdle, at least typically in the near term, in fact, I guess, which is to say, for instance, maybe you can have sort of privacy preserving features, but there's going to be some essential extra tech there, and that's going to potentially be costly. Of course, in the long run, I remember when we used to have external hard drives for our laptops and our PCs because our computers could barely, store any amount of information. And now we don't do that anymore, right? My smartphone has more storage than, my laptop did, I don't know, 10 years ago, right? So is it fair to think in the future that we will be in a position where it will be easy for users to basically say, this is the level of privacy I want on this particular piece of information, and they'll be able to do that in an economical way?
So this is very much the cryptography of how this is done is very much not my technical expertise. So I can't give a precise answer on this, but my impression is that the answer is yes, that and that the problem may not be as hard as what you just described, because a lot of times it's whether something is let in or out of a data enclave more than it's about doing operations on something without revealing it, right? It's a question of what you allow access to more than about sort of enabling access without without full revelation. There is, by the way, although as you say, there's a lot of really interesting, and again, it's not really my field, but I've been exposed to bits of it in auction theory and stuff. There is a bunch of really interesting cryptography work on how to do things like run auctions where you can figure out the winner and verify and validate the winner without revealing anybody's bids. So there are circumstances in which you can sometimes do things where the entire computation is sort of fully private. But here I think it's much more about layers of permissioning and where things are stored in such a fashion that you can prove ownership of something, you can share particular components, and my impression is that's on the near term horizon even. Okay. But as I say, I'm not an expert, so don't nobody should take my word for it.
Yes. I want to, unless Fahad, you want to follow up, I wanted to switch a little bit gear and ask about some. Yeah.
So maybe then let me ask one last question. Yeah. It's not exactly a follow up, but it touches on something, Scott, that you were talking about in a prior answer, which is, and this is again sort of I think thinking about this from a more layman's perspective, which is that so you've described a sort of a certain level of customization on the user end, and that that does sound great, but I think operationally the question always becomes how do we actually get this done, given that in the back end things are happening that will probably be too complicated for users? And I feel like detractors to blockchain frequently bring up things like this, but in my mind, and this is not something that I know too well, so I'm just sort of think of me as a totally layperson as I say this. I think about the internet, and I remember, in fact, I've given presentations about blockchain to technical audiences, and I featured Netscape Navigator 1.0 in my slide deck as a way of saying to them, I actually think Netscape Navigator 1.0 was probably the most important thing in the history of the internet. And I realize it sort of irritates, very technical people, because they're like, wait, what are you talking about? It's just a wrapper. I mean, it's right. Like, yes,
exactly. Come on, it's like the routing algorithm is the most important contribution.
Right. For most of the world, you need some kind of wrapper to make it easy to use the system. And until you have that, then, how are you going to get sort of mass adoption? And so part of it is I was hoping you could talk a little bit about kind of how the user experience is supposed to work in here. And also, again, this from sort of a lay perspective, I think of digital wallets a bit like I think of web browsers. Even in the sense of like, if I'm interacting with a smart contract, I could accidentally put in a silly website that's, a scam website. And a lot of times my browser will tell me, did you really mean that or something like that? But at least the digital wallets I'm familiar with, they don't do the same sorts of things. In fact,
some of them try now. They're getting better. Like MetaMask will, for those who are listening who aren't familiar with the specific product, MetaMask is one of many digital wallet products, and they have like a sort of a variety of different mechanisms they now use to like warn you about ways in which a smart contract might interact with your wallet or something of the sort. But all of this is far from perfect, and one has to
right. That point is well taken, by the way. You're right. MetaMask does have a, but I guess the point is, I don't think it's quite yet at Netscape Navigator 1.0 level, but they're trying.
It might be at Netscape Navigator level. I mean, remember Netscape Navigator, you could also navigate to all sorts of places where there were computer viruses and so forth. Like we didn't have robust ways of even understanding what the different threat vectors were as much in the early internet.
Okay.
But yeah, no, I mean, I think of, for most people's interactions with blockchains today, leaving aside, if you're interacting entirely through you have a Coinbase account or some other custodial, exchange account where you're just, sort of interacting with blockchains out there in the universe while you're doing some transaction in an internal ledger. Other than that, most interactions with blockchains today are often really high friction, right? Like either, you're directly interfacing with a piece of software, and the software layer is sort of very close to the rails of this part of the internet, right? You never, presumably, you've never had to think about, what's the IP address that that this URL is resolving to, or, rarely. Maybe when you set up your website, you do this once and you learn what an A record is, and you're like, okay, cool, great. I'm glad I never have to think about that again. But when interacting with a blockchain application, which I do this a couple times a day, most days, I have to go and point to the equivalent of the IP address, right? I have to point to the smart contract address. I have to make sure I've got it right, because there might be others that, that are similar, and it'll just break, or worse, something fraudulent might steal whatever I'm trying to interact with. I have to think about the processing cost, right? When you open up a an app on your smartphone, probably AWS in the background is inducing some small processing cost of the company that runs the application, but the user isn't paying a fraction of a penny to subsidize that AWS cost. Whereas when you're transacting on the Ethereum blockchain, you have to think about how much you're willing to pay given the current congestion pricing rate, right? The current block fees. And so every time I do one of these smart contract transactions, first I'm looking up the equivalent of the IP address. Then I'm thinking about how much I'm willing to pay for compute, which is a function of how much I care about having this thing happen quickly, how big a computation it is, all these different features. That can't be the average user experience. But, rather, they can't, in order for this to be accessible for the average user, that can't be the average user experience. But by the same token, there are some things that are kind of similar to that we do a lot. When you go to an online shopping website, you decide, what type of shipping fee you want to pay for how quickly you get it. You think about, if you're buying from eBay or Amazon, you think about the reputation of a marketplace seller potentially and deciding whether you want to buy from seller one or seller two of a seemingly similar product. And again, those don't, those are still much simpler and more seamless, and lots of things we do, just going to a website, we don't interact with any of this architecture, under the hood architecture. But all of those are abstractions from an internet that's in many ways just as complicated as the blockchain internet. And as you say, wallets are kind of like web browsers, and they're kind of like really early web browsers mostly right now, with exceptions, which is that for some specialized use cases, you see these heavily abstracted wallets, right? For some online game that's going to have a blockchain backend, the user doesn't, but the user never or at most rarely needs to touch, there you might have a completely abstracted wallet that is basically just your portal into the game. And you actually control all those digital assets. You can do other things with them. You could even withdraw them and take custody of them. But transaction fees are handled by the application. Ownership is scoped to something that looks more like a Web 2 platform experience that you've seen. These things are starting to exist for individual applications. I think the big difference is when in that world in Web 2, when you create a profile on Amazon or something, it doesn't instantaneously also become a profile on, also it doesn't instantaneously, I used eBay before, so it doesn't also instantaneously become a profile you could use on eBay. Whereas in crypto land, when you create a profile on one online marketplace, you actually do get sort of on the back end an account that is portable and does give you some degree of control and ownership that at least in principle you could also use on some other marketplace, right? If you have an account that you use to connect to OpenSea to trade NFTs, you can use that account to mint NFTs on some third-party website, and you can use it to exchange NFTs on some other marketplace. And it's one account that you take everywhere. And so I think as high-value consumer applications start using this stuff, people are going to have these accounts that are actually much more flexible than they're used to, but look a lot like the form factor of what they're used to from Web 2. And that combination has the potential to make Web 3 very accessible.
Yeah, so just to recap, you mentioned that the multifunctionality of the account is really what you think is the game changer, the fact that
exactly. The multifunctionality of the account, I'm not sure that's the unique game changer, but it's a feature that means once people start entering the ecosystem, they've actually entered it writ large, right? You haven't just created actually a great analogy. Shop.pay is probably the closest thing to a Web3 product that many people have used. So Shop.pay, Link, there are a couple of, Shop.pay is the most prevalent one I've seen. So actually, I don't remember if it's dot or just Shop Pay, whatever. Shop Pay, the payment, the sort of the individual payment sort of architecture around websites that use Shopify as the backend. Now when you go to a Shopify, marketplace, a Shopify store, it might say do you want to pay with Shop Pay? We've already got your address, we've already got your, sort of shipping preferences, we've already got your credit card number. Just click here to pay. Oh, and by the way, you're collecting rewards everywhere you go. Right? That's an infinitely easier experience, right? It wasn't that long ago, 5 years ago, you had to type in your address on every single, marketplace website. And any small business website you went to, you'd have to figure out whether you trusted their system. You'd probably have to enter your credit card number and create a separate account with maybe 5 special characters, 2 numbers, a capital letter, a lowercase letter, and the pound symbol, who knows what. They could have a new account to remember, a new password to remember, and you have to enter all your information again. Now, tons of small businesses, at least in the US, are all on one single unified payment architecture that follows you around the internet. And when you sign up, you fill in your address for any one of them, right? The first time you enter a Shop Pay, market site, and buy something, you've created this account that you can use everywhere. Web3 is like that, but for everything on the internet.
But so in that example, who controls that identity system?
Shop. So I believe it's, and I don't know how it's, how the corporate architecture of this works. I think it's actually just part of Shopify, not a subsidiary or something. But yeah,
so
exactly.
Coming back to what you were saying earlier. there's like there's the security issue potentially, in the sense that there obviously there's franchise value. I'm not suggesting that the incentives are not properly aligned for Shopify or whomever, but there is in some sense the centralization risk that we were discussing earlier in that context.
Oh, and there totally is, right? Like, if all the merchants, all the merchants on Shopify, are taking advantage of this like very unified, architecture and ecosystem and customer base, Shop can say, we're gonna raise your fees this year, and there's nothing really you could do about it because like all the customers like using our payment processor, or if something goes wrong with their architecture, right? Like you can sort of break, all of commerce simultaneously, and moreover, the sellers often don't have. I'm not completely sure how Shop manages this, but in many of these sorts of contexts, the sellers do not actually have the same level of data and information control that the centralized platform that manages the sort of identifiers does, right? Actually, it shares sort of like the minimum amount required to enable the seller to, carry out the transaction. But, they would maybe prefer to not have this intermediary in the middle, or have the intermediary have a credible commitment to always allow them to have whatever information was useful.
Yeah, I think the remainder of this conversation, I briefly want to touch upon one of the topics that is currently being discussed extensively, how blockchain can interface with AI. So, and I want to break this question into two separate questions. The first is, what are your views on the usefulness of AI for blockchain? Meaning, first of all, are there potentially clear applications that we see here, or you think the value is more incremental? Like AI is everywhere, and maybe we can try to use it in blockchain as well. So just
when you say using AI in blockchains, do you mean using AI tools to actually run blockchain architectures, or do you mean like sort of in conjunction with blockchains in various fashions?
I'm thinking more. The second, more in conjunction with blockchain. For
Got
example,
it.
and we can think about AI tools for like services, or we can think of AI tools for infrastructure, like
Great.
or maybe none of them.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, cool. So, first of all, we've already seen like a medium scale explosion of different marketplace products that are using blockchains as sort of architectures for managing AI information networks, data sharing, like, all of the different things that, all of the different things that sort of help or stand to help both liquefy the market for AI technology and liquefy in the sense of make competitive and open and accessible.
Right. So
the market for AI.
Yeah, we are thinking more of blockchain for AI. Like that's the second part of the question.
I see. Gosh, yeah.
But,
Sorry,
but
maybe I'm missing the. Maybe I'm missing this dichotomy. Like,
So, I'm thinking I see two phases now. There is AI for blockchain. So how can one use all the technology that is being developed around AI to address questions or problems that blockchain has, and the second, which I think
sorry, you're right. I have them flipped. We'll come back. We'll come back to infrastructure solution.
Right,
blockchain infrastructure solutions for AI.
But it's great to hear what you're saying. Like you're thinking that there are already, you mentioned like many marketplaces which are leveraging the blockchain technologies to handle AI.
Yep.
And
great. But sorry, we'll shelve that and come back to it. So how AI uses for blockchain, I think, is a little bit less clear, in the sense that it's sort of not completely clear what the specific problem. Sort of beyond the sort of standards, right? Like, it is massively easier to write Solidity code with the help of an AI copilot. As somebody who's written small amounts of Solidity code before AI and much more of it afterwards, like, can confirm. But like, the challenge there, I think this is actually the challenge with a lot of these generative AI tools, is they're not yet very well optimized for many specific problems, right? There's sort of like there's a next wave of innovation that's going on now, right? Like I don't mean to say that no one's doing this, but like, sort of over the last like 2 years or so, they've started, figuring out what these things specialize well to, right? The problem with a big general purpose innovation is you actually have to sort of fit it for all the different types of applications, and along the way figure out which applications it's best fit for. I'm not completely like, I don't have a strong instinct about which types of problems other than sort of like in very abstract senses, right? Like AI systems can often like, sort of hallucinate computations faster. They can create lots of sort of new types of information that then, sort of may be useful in making the sort of the computational aspects of blockchains more efficient or more useful. But I'm not sure there's like a specific problem I have off the top of my head that just feels like, okay, this is something that like generative AI should solve for blockchain systems. Although
So
again,
can
I mean,
I-
like,
can
I'm
I
not
throw
sure.
one-
Sorry, go ahead.
So can I throw one out there? And this is,
Yeah.
I'm just throwing it out there. Just spit.
Yeah,
just
free disposal, and
spitballing here.
totally possible you've thought of something I haven't. Go ahead.
Yeah, it's just a question of maybe it's not a good idea, but anyway, let's see how it goes. So it sort of relates to what we were talking about earlier, which is, okay, there's a lot of stuff on blockchain that is essentially decentralized finance, automated market makers, et cetera, et cetera. That's probably the biggest thing actually on something like Ethereum right now. And then you have a lot of users who maybe don't fully understand exactly what's going on. And so in terms of making, sort of solving that problem.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
One thought process, and I just want to touch on one other thing, which is, I guess it's 7702, the up part of the Spectra upgrade, right? Was this idea that I could attach my regular account, my externally owned account, so-called, to essentially a bunch of code, a smart contract. And so you could imagine kind of using that to then get users to be able to do more sophisticated things. But still, the point is that, this is kind of a complicated financial market system. And maybe AI can sort of fit in the middle there, because it's not clear. Yes, I can write a smart contract to do automated things associated with a bunch of AMMs and so on. I'm not sure that's going to go so well. Because
Right, yeah. Okay, so if
I'll
that's
ask ChatGPT to write the code anyway.
right, exactly. So that's sort of in my like Copilot category, right? Like if we're willing to call circumstances in which AIs stand to make blockchains more functional or useful for users, like there's a huge bunch, right? Like there's things like that, and again, no opinions about how well it'll work at any given stage, but like, one thing LLMs are incredibly good at is sort of summarizing and organizing and sort of like making interpretable very complicated information, right? And so just as we're starting to see LLM-based, search panels, right? Like, now when you search on Google, you get like Gemini hits, again, sort of which could be hit or miss, but like they're Gemini hits, hit or miss. That was unintentional and great. It's a new architecture for sort of using search in a way that it sort of gives more comprehensive answers. While assimilating and compressing a lot of complexity. Certainly, like, as we were just talking about, right? Like, blockchains at the moment, especially because people are running so close to the rails of the internet, like, has tons of complexity and introduces lots of new marketplaces with new types of complexity, as you're mentioning with DeFi and so forth. In that sort of category too, I mean, like, AI creates wealths of new application opportunities, right? Like at the app level, there are lots of things that people are doing with AI tools, whether it's like, remixing content or, creating sort of like agents that are going to go and do transactions on their behalf, things like that. I don't know whether this is like this is actually what I thought was originally being described as blockchain for AI rather than AI for blockchain. But I actually think based on this pairing, it's the opposite. This is AI for blockchain. These are AI tools that that sort of need blockchain architectures in order for them to be useful, right? Like if you're, or that necessitate or or raise the value of blockchain-based structures, right? So we talked about digital property rights. You could use, in fact, people are building this. Like my friends at Story Protocol, which is an A16Z portfolio company, like spend a lot of time thinking about programmable intellectual property infrastructures that then enable AI-based remixing, right? So like one of the big problems people face in sort of the explosion of AI remixing tools is that there's a lot of concern about intellectual property and sort of provenance of, imagery, media, sound, all of the different things that are being remixed faster than we can even track it. And what Story Protocol proposes to do is to sort of try and turn this, huge challenge for intellectual property into a marketplace opportunity, right? Try and instead say, look, what if we created a programmable intellectual property primitive where people can, we were talking earlier about permission how the IP is used, what licensing has to look like, which ways, sort of who can use it and in what ways. And so then make it possible for people to plug into a marketplace that has sort of proper guardrails around remixing along with a chain of provenance and attribution. And in that sense, like, maybe now you have a way to sort of exempt, sort of like again, blockchain for AI for blockchain, don't know which, but like, you have a way to accelerate and create like a real market structure around intellectual property remixing in a way that's actually like net, value creating for everybody, right? There's somehow it like turns what was previously a huge tension into a huge opportunity. Similarly, like, AI agents, right? Like one of my favorite examples, I read these Japanese mystery novels. They're a specific genre. It's called hankaku. They're these extremely like puzzly novels, right? They're like every one of them is a puzzle. Like they're sort of the ultimate fair play novel style. Like everything you need to solve the mystery is in front of you, and the question is just after 300 pages, can you? And often you can't, which is astounding. They get translated into English at some frequency. But by a variety of different publishers under, sort of on pretty stochastic timing. I would love to be able to create an AI agent that would just go out and like figure out when new ones have been published and like, just buy them for me and have them shipped to my house, right? Like, cause I do this every like 5 months or so. I'll just go through all the publishers I know that publish these, get all the new ones that I've got my reading for the next, sort of 3 months. But like you could imagine an AI agent would do this for you. But like, how do you establish the guardrails? How do you, sort of manage like sort of these like sort of very cross-platform payments? How do you, make sure that the AI hasn't decided to go and buy you 500 copies? Like, how do you give it instructions that are clearly stated and immutable? And all of these, again, blockchains are the natural architecture for doing it. And again, I think in the dichotomy, the way we've talked about it, this is AI for blockchain in the sense that it's AI use cases that give blockchain something new and powerful to do.
Yeah, that's great. And do you want to say something about blockchain for AI? Then?
Okay, cool. We'll reverse. So now
That's
blockchain for AI, blockchain making AI work better.
Yeah.
This is data permissioning, right? Like marketplaces, if I have a huge data source and I want to license it for use in AI applications, especially if I maybe want to license it for use in like some sort of like individual agent, like pull data to do something applications, same thing. I need to be able to create an open API with very strict and like defined guardrails and control how and when the data is used and how I get compensated for its use. This is, again, like sort of exactly what, sort of what blockchains are good at. Similarly, we're seeing marketplaces for like, for AI compute, for figuring out like, which AI models should be used for what and or for service providers to like run models, to run computations. There's, and gosh, I mean, and sort of things come full circle, right? Like, sort of blockchains have, among other things, like enabled improvements in prediction markets and other information aggregation mechanisms. We've seen platforms like Jensen that do another A16Z portfolio company. Sorry, I don't actually know. I'm just, if I'm referencing a company that in some fashion is tied to the firm, good to disclose. we've seen them think about how do you use information aggregation mechanisms in the context of an AI compute marketplace. How do you use information aggregation mechanisms, which are themselves facilitated by blockchains, to figure out what model or which service provider is the right one for a given computational task. There's lots and lots of just simple, questions like, how do you make an AI agent deterministic? How do you make them available for licensing? How do you give someone ownership of them? Right? AI agents are digital assets. And, we're starting to see, both Web 2 and Web 3 marketplaces that are in one fashion or another trying to enable people to create AI agents to then license to others for use, right? Like, maybe if I invent, a great agent for going and buying all the Hankaku novels, I can post it to like some sort of like mystery novel forum and say, hey, anybody who wants to, go to, get all the Hankaku novels can rent my AI agent at a price of like 50 cents a year or something. Honestly, I'd probably give it away for free, but, but again, like in order to enable marketplace interactions around digital assets, especially ones that are going to involve cross-platform interactions and need to operate without, massive degrees of oversight on what's under the hood. And yet also in order to make those marketplaces secure, right? If I, what's to say if I've created a bot that, sort of, again, not actually doing this, but theoretically, if I created a bot that's going to go out and buy Hankaku mystery novels for people, like, what's to say that, I can't later go in and swap out the code and make it like, sort of spy on what's, what people are browsing or something. Everyone's installed, this happens, by the way, with Chrome and other browser extensions, right? Like the company, goes out of business or gets acquired, and then the acquirer changes the permissions and so forth. And sometimes users don't notice. And like something goes from being a really useful functional extension to being essentially spyware. Like, how do I commit that my bot is going to keep doing what I've said it's going to do? Blockchains are perfect for that, right? The bot is an immutable, deterministic or semi-deterministic piece of code that is guaranteed to work the way it's been configured. It's auditable. Someone can look at it and say, okay, good, I understand what this is going to do. And Scott can't change it. He can just license it and permission my use of it. So all of these types of things, I think, blockchains stand to both make the doing of AI, like compute and inference and so forth, much more powerful. And then, and again, I don't know which side of the dichotomy it is. I guess what we're really learning is that these things are so tightly interlinked that it's not even clear. You could sort of call them antipodes. But they also really stand to make marketplace interactions around AI tools so much more robust on both sides, both marketplaces in the tools and tools using marketplaces.
So if I'm understanding that correctly, I think that dovetails very well with kind of maybe what we were talking about in the first half of this conversation, because the way I'm understanding is that, okay, so one way to think about it is AI agents are, let's say at a very high level, can be very useful, but what makes them useful, right? Like there's input before the output, and that's like, so that's data. And so where is it going to be pulling the data? Well, this goes to this idea of a common ledger. There's an advantage to that. But if you just have a common ledger where there's like a central party that controls the data, then let's just say for the moment, bad things can happen. And I'll sort of leave it there. We talked about it earlier in the podcast. So the
well, again, sorry, we can underscore that in this context, which is, in the last couple of years, we've seen many different online platforms curtail or sort of severely limit or entirely stop open access to their APIs because of concerns about scraping of the data for use in training AI models, right? Like this is very real. Like this did happen,
right?
Imagine if you had built your entire business around that type of API access, or for that matter, around collecting a bunch of data that you wanted to be able to control how it was used. Right? Both of those cases are subject to really serious API risk. And, blockchains provide a natural architecture for this to instead be a marketplace. Sorry, go ahead.
So so I didn't mean to minimize it all. And so, and more than that, earlier in the conversation, you touched on sort of another point, a related point actually, which is, I think people sometimes, as a straw man, they think of the idea that, whoever, let's say, is the centralized party storing the data might just do something binary in a malicious way, like just purely cut off access or something, but they could also just like charge for it, right? Like what you're doing is also you're creating market power, right? And so like in many cases, the decentralized party perceives an amount of franchise value, and the optimal thing is to like basically act like a monopolist and to extract rents. And so that stuff, definitely happens. So these are real concerns. But I kind of feel like there's sort of three pieces that we've been talking about that now become basically turbocharged when you talk about AI, because they can make AI useful. So again, AI, the data is very useful to make the AI agent useful, but you want to actually have the data secure in the sense that, for instance, somebody just can't cut me off from the system or start threatening to charge me if or they'll cut me off. But then there's there's data, there's the security, or at least what I'm calling security of it. But there's a third piece that we also touched on, which is sort of optionality. And so here, what I think, optionality as a user as to what data I actually want to be fed in. And here, what I start thinking about is like, we all have our smartphones in our pockets, and we have all these apps on our smartphones. And, we probably have all of these apps, or at least most of them, tied to some account that has some level of like initial settings and so on. Because, it would be really awful if I opened up Spotify and none of my playlists were there. That would be awful.
That would be irritating. I agree.
Yes, exactly. And so in some sense, you're kind of like saying, well, okay, imagine all of these apps on your smartphone were sort of pulling from a common data source, but we're only pulling the things that you want them to be able to pull, and nobody can cut you off from that.
Yes.
And that seems like it's quite powerful, actually. Like that sounds...
Yeah, so that ties. You're totally right. This ties everything we've talked about together really nicely, right? Like, and it's a look. I think it is a model of the internet that we're sort of moving towards, right? Like we're moving to more and more AI mediated interactions, and I hope along with that, more and more data liquidity in the sense of data being sort of portable and transferable across applications, but with control, right? Like sort of data liquidity with user control rather than sort of with like, opaque platforms in the background sharing things in ways we don't even understand.
I think this is a great time, I think, to maybe wrap up and conclude this wonderful crypto conversation that we have had with Scott Kominers. Thanks, Scott, for sharing your insights and views on the blockchain. I think definitely we touched up on many different topics, well and beyond finance. And I would like also to thank my co-host Fahad for organizing it. And I would like to remind that this is basically a podcast series that is offered by the Center for Digital Finance Technologies, for which I'm the faculty director, and Fahad is the cryptocurrency economic advisor.